Hello, my little chickadees. How are you doing today? So, there's a lot to go through today. Today is the last day of our chapter on manifest destiny and the cost of expansion. And we kind of really need to wrap things up. So, we're going to go through a lot of stuff today. Obviously, if you're watching this, I either went way too fast for you, which is a possibility, or you missed class today. And that's okay. I hope you're well and I hope things are going okay. And if you have questions, please reach out. I will tell you this, because I went so fast, I actually screenshotted all of these slides, except the first one with the goals for the day, because you don't write those down anyway. I screenshotted the slides and I loaded them in Classroom. They should actually be just below this post if you're looking at this in Classroom. If you're watching me in YouTube, go back to Classroom and look at the post below, and then there should be something there. Okay. All right. So I am going to get this stuff up on the screen for you so you can actually read it and get it. But like I said, I gave you the slides. So make sure that you're ready for that. Okay. All right. I will jump away here. Maybe. Okay. There we go. All right, so today is 10/1. Congratulations, you made it to October. It's the spookiest month of the year. Decorate something, carve a pumpkin. I don't know, watch a scary movie. Hocus Pocus will probably be on TV like 87,000 times in the next few months. So catch up with the Sanders sisters and what is it, Binkley, something, the cat. I don't know. I think it's something like that. I don't know. That movie's it's weird. I don't know. I don't know why people are so obsessed with it. I'll watch Halloween, like 50 times. All right, so your reminders for today. First of all, you have your unit quiz on manifest destiny and the cost of expansion. Tomorrow in class, we're going to have you guys log in, say hi, do some trivia, and then I'm going to share that form with you guys. Basically, the setup of the quiz is going to be about 8 true and false questions. There's going to be about 7 or 8 multiple choice questions. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you 2 short essays, and you're going to get to pick which one you want to do. Okay. So not particularly long. I'm not going to make it due at the end of class. I'm going to make it due by midnight. Yes, you can use your notes. Yes, you can use your resources. Okay. So obviously I'm expecting everybody to do pretty well. At least that's my hope. And obviously I'll be here to answer questions if you need me to, but that's tomorrow. So don't look for that right now. It's not going to be there till tomorrow. 2 other things I wanted to talk to you about. Yesterday, which would have been Wednesday, the 30th, you should have gotten an email from somebody named Stephanie Mornaka, who is the social worker psychologist here at the high school. And it was about something called the CBITS survey. We're going to be doing that on Tuesday morning at 9 o'clock. They're going to send you out a link to a separate Google Meet. And yes, that does mean you're going to miss the first chunk of your first hour class on Tuesday, October 6th. More information to come about that. I'll talk about it in classes probably on Monday too, but they'll send you links. So make sure you're checking your email. And yes, your first hour teachers know you're probably going to miss the first 25 minutes of class. Last reminder, your assignment for the week is due tonight by midnight. That's going to be the one about the U.S. versus the Sioux tribe. That one's got 2 parts to it, so make sure you do both. Discussion for today is going to hinge around what happened to the tribes. Again, we're going to wrap up that idea. Then we're going to talk a little bit about work in the West. Please do remember, again, I screenshotted the things and put them down below for you. Then we're going to give you some work time, if you need that for history to finish things up. And remember, I'm here to answer questions. Today's GIF is because I'm racing towards the finish line in this chapter, but I feel like I have to go so fast that boom, I go into the ground. I hope that girl wasn't hurt. Anyway, it's still kind of funny. All right. So yesterday, if you were here with us or if you watched the video, you know that we talked about what happened to tribes, and we focused in on the Cheyenne. The Cheyenne were a tribe that tried to surrender, but got massacred and then eventually ended up on reservations in Indian Territory or Oklahoma. And then we talked about the Nez Perce Indians, a peaceful tribe of Indians that tried to flee to Canada or run away, and they got caught by the army, and they too ended up on a reservation in Oklahoma, except for their chief, who got sent to Washington. Today we're going to talk about the tribe that fought back. We're going to talk about the Sioux. Now, quickly, the Sioux aren't just one tribe. It's actually 7 tribes together. They are probably one of the most famous tribes in the United States, and I think one of the reasons for that is first of all, they had a lot of really leaders that you guys know. They had Sitting Bull, who was one of their main chiefs, who was not just a chief, but he was also like this amazing military mind. So I guess you kind of call him a general. And they also had a guy named Crazy Horse, and Crazy Horse is kind of this mythical, you can't tell where reality and legend kind of stop and start. Great warrior. White people thought he couldn't be killed by white people. Like they thought he was like the boogeyman, but in reality, he was just this really great like military leader, general type of person. And you might know Crazy Horse because if you've ever been out around Mount Rushmore, there's a Crazy Horse monument that they're blasting and I think lasering into a mountain out there. It's going to be huge when it's done. It's like the four heads on Mount Rushmore fit in Crazy Horse's face. That's how big it is. And there's a big Native American museum there too. It's pretty cool. I definitely recommend it if you go. And if you go at night, they do like a laser show and stuff like that. But the Sioux are well known because they stand up to the U.S. military and also because they had one of the best armies in the world at that time. I guess the best comparison history-wise I can make is the Sioux might be like the Spartans of the Native American world, if you know what a Spartan was back in the day. Now, the Sioux lived in like the Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Montana, Wyoming type area. They were nomadic, meaning they moved around to chase the food, the buffalo usually. And from a young age, Sioux men or Sioux boys were taught to hunt and to fight. And so they were well-versed in combat. And settlers started to use a trail called the Bozeman Trail to cross through Sioux land. And it was very offensive to the Sioux because it crossed through their hunting grounds, and their hunting grounds were sacred or religiously important to them. And so the Sioux first complained. They were like, hey, listen, white folks, we don't want you coming through our land. You need to stop this. But when the white settlers didn't listen, they started to aggressively protect their land. The U.S. military obviously didn't like this, and so they built some defense posts along the Bozeman Trail to try to protect the white settlers and to also deter or stop the tribes from doing anything negative to the settlers. The problem with the forts is they didn't have a lot of their own supplies. So once a month, a supply train would come through and bring them the things that they needed to be, surviving at their forts. 1 month, that wagon train was led by a guy named Colonel Fetterman. Colonel is Colonelman. I just combined both words. Derp. Colonel Fetterman led this wagon train, and he had 82 men and himself, and their job was to go down the Bozeman Trail and get the supplies to the different forts. Well, as they were going through kind of a narrow place in the Bozeman Trail, it was surrounded heavily by woods on each side. A Sioux warrior jumped down into the trail in front of them, made a war cry, and shot an arrow over the top of the entire wagon train. Didn't hit a thing. Should have been the first cue that something was wrong. Made another war cry and ran back up into the woods. Now, Fetterman has himself and 82 men. You have two options at this point. You go, nope to the nope, and you keep going, or you order all your men into the woods. Well, Fetterman decided to order all of his men into the woods to get that one warrior who insulted them, except when he got into the woods, there were hundreds of Sioux warriors in the woods, and they knew the territory well, and they were ready, and they had a plan, and there was a massacre. The Fetterman massacre, to be exact. The white soldiers were all killed. None were left alive. Their bodies were piled, and parts of their bodies were piled in the middle of the Bozeman Trail. And when settlers started to come down the trail, that's kind of like a big stop sign when you see a pile of body parts, and you decide that that's not a good place to go. The Sioux fought for a little while longer, and they were doing really, really well. And then they agreed to a Fort Laramie Treaty of, I think it was 1868, and were removed to the Black Hills. Now, they got to kind of stay in their area, but not the whole area. They were isolated into a spot in the Black Hills called the Badlands. Now, if you've ever been out west, the Badlands are really cool. I really like the Badlands, but I don't think they'd be a cool place to live. I don't think much grows there. I mean, there's animals there, but it's not the same kind of hunting the Sioux were used to. And just generally, I mean, let's be honest, it's called the Badlands for a reason. And the Sioux survive there. They exist there. They grumpily go along with what they're told. And then gold prospectors show up. People with shovels looking for shiny stuff, and they find some. And as we've learned so far in this unit, and I hope you figure this out, when one person finds gold, more people show up. And so more white people flood into the area, much to the dismay of the Sioux. But then, whenever a lot of white people show up someplace, someone decides they want to build a railroad through it. And so railroad builders came in and started to build railroads through the area, and this irritated the Sioux. The government gave them a solution and said, well, we can move you to Indian territory too, The Sioux said no, and the Indian War between the Sioux and the United States really intensified. There were a number of big battles, a number of wins on both sides, probably the two most famous ones, and I really can't call what happened at Wounded Knee a battle. It's unfair, but that's what history books do, so I'm going to just call it what they do so that you guys don't get confused, but I'm going to be honest with you when I explain it. The first battle that's really famous, and most people know about this one, is the Battle of Little Bighorn, which is probably more famously known as Custer's Last Stand, not Custard. We're not going to Culver's. Custer, Custer. And it's made famous by the losing leader at that. And he is a lieutenant colonel in the American 7th Cavalry. Cavalry means they're riding horses. And his name is George Armstrong Custer. And George Armstrong Custer is, well, let's just put it this way, he's not a good guy. There's no way for me to sugarcoat it. He was a narcissist. That means he really, really, really liked himself. He was willing to sacrifice his men to make himself famous. He was okay letting soldiers die as long as he got his name in the paper. He was heavily photographed because he employed his own personal photographer. And he used a really cowardly strategy to fight against the native tribes on the plains. He would wait until the men would leave to go out on a hunt, and then he would go into villages and kidnap the women and children or take them hostage. And then when the men came back, he would be like, if you don't surrender, we're going to kill your women and children. Now, to me, that's kind of shady. It's not good. It's not okay. And at the Battle of Little Bighorn, what happens is Armstrong Custer believes that he has found or has been shown where a small Sioux village is. But some of the math on it doesn't add up. There's too many teepees, there's too many horses, but all his scouts see are women, children, and elderly people. So Custer's like, yeah, I'm going to do my thing. We're going to ride in there. We're going to take these people hostage. Maybe we have to kill a few people. But then when the soldiers come back, we're going to be like, hey, we got your women and children. It's time for you to quit. And we'll win. I'll get my name in the paper, and woo-ha, I'm famous. But that's not how it goes. Custer and his men ride into the village. It was a setup. Sitting Bull had come up with this plan to basically hide his warriors. Some were in teepees, some were in the woods, some were in ditch lines. And for some reason, Custer didn't plan for this. And when he rode into the village with his 400 men, he was faced with about 4,000 native people. The native peoples were highly trained. They had weapons, they had rifles, they had their bows and arrows, they had everything that they needed. And Custer and his men they got whooped. They died. Custer's grave is still on the battlefield. You can actually, in one of those pictures, see two of the gravestones on the battlefield. And on the top picture, you can see Sitting Bull, who was the mastermind behind this. It's a great win for the Sioux. Don't get me wrong. It's a huge win. It's a big W, all right? But it really puts the government's focus and the Army's focus on beating the Sioux. For the next chunk of years, there's a back and forth, a lot of battles, a lot of losses on both sides, more so on the Sioux. The Army keeps sending out new men. The Sioux only have so many. Eventually, things start to look really bad. And in 1890, what happens is the Battle of Wounded Knee. Again, the Wounded Knee Massacre is probably what I would call it if I was writing a history book. At Wounded Knee, the Sioux Native tribe, along with some Cheyenne and Comanche Indians, decide that they're going to have a religious ceremony called the Ghost Dance. Settlers and people in the area are intimidated by the number of natives that are in one place, and so they contact the military. The military doesn't necessarily want to pick a fight, but they see this as an opportunity to arrest some of the people that were involved in Custer's Last Stand, and so they ride into the camp with several troops of soldiers, as you know from the map assignment you're supposed to be doing for me. And they demanded the surrender of some of the Sioux leaders, and they said, you need to hand over your weapons. Well, in the struggle over the weapons, a shot gets fired. No one knows for sure who shot it. It was probably over the struggle for something. It was probably an accident. Regardless, American soldiers start to fire into the crowd. And 290 Sioux men, women, and children, some of which were doing the religious ceremony Ghost Dance and not involved in the argument at all, are killed. 25 American soldiers are killed, mostly by friendly fire when Hotchkiss guns, or big rotating guns, up on top of a hilltop open fire on the group. The next day, the slaughter is evident to everyone. The second part of your assignment this week, Black Elk Speaks, kind of goes through those feelings and how that went. Sounds like someone's walking on the roof. It's weird. Okay. Oh, someone's definitely walking above me right now. It's creepy. Anyway, At this point, the Sioux are kind of like, there's no way we can win, and so they surrender and are removed to a reservation. When the Sioux surrender, that really kind of spells the end for most tribes. I think the general feeling is, if the Sioux can't win, how can we? And what happens is the end of Indian independence. Now, obviously, a lot of the tribes get removed to reservations, places like Indian Territory and small pockets of land on various states. Like there are reservations in northern Wisconsin, for instance, where a number of the tribes that you guys know, like the Lac de Flambeau or, let's see, Bad River, Red Cliff, tribes all have chunks of land, and there's way more. There's a ton, Potawatomi, different groups. Okay, generally speaking, those lands were not great. They were kind of the land no one wanted. They weren't great for farming. They weren't great for hunting. The tribe still tried to live communally, like as one big group, and still tried to follow their traditions for the first part of their time on reservations, or the removal time. Some problem happened, though, in that the government decided that one way to make sure that they didn't have any further problem with the Indian tribes was to educate their children to be like white Americans. And so they opened Indian academies and boarding schools in the eastern part of the country. Small children were taken away from their native parents. They were enrolled in these schools, and it was what was it? Save the man, kill the savage, or kill the savage, save the man, were the mottos of some of these schools. The most famous was Carlisle Indian School, or Carlisle Indian Academy, which was in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And basically the mission of these schools was to Americanize these kids. They made speaking their own language a punishable offense. Little boys had to cut their hair and wear proper American clothing, a shirt and tie, a proper jacket, pants. Okay. The girls were forced to, the girls were treated awfully. The women that ran their schools said they were dirty because they were native. And I read one account one time where they were forced to wash their hair with steel wool, like the scrubby stuff you used to get, like stuff out of pots and pans, and like some really nasty crap like lye, because they had to kill the bugs that were in their hair. But they were trained to speak English, to read English, to write English. They were severely punished for doing anything that was like their old way. And basically, they taught them skills and trades that would be used in the white world, and they kind of just trained the native culture out of them. When these kids went back to their homelands, they couldn't identify with anybody, and they didn't fit anymore. And that's assimilation and Americanization. Okay. Now, with the kids removed, you kind of figure you're getting rid of the future of the culture in a way. But then, to make sure that the present adults aren't as big a problem, the government passed the Dawes Severalty Act. Instead of the reservation being one big chunk of tribal land, they split it up into family units. Each family got 160 acres of land, which they could farm on, which is weird because not all the tribes were farmers, but they were forced to farm. They were forced to put a house on their land. They had to learn English. And if they lived on that land and farmed on that land for 25 years, it became theirs, and they became a U.S. citizen. Again, maybe on the surface, that doesn't sound too bad. Free land, farmer, house, citizenship. But the reality of things is it's taking away the culture. It's forcing a more American way of life on those people. Now, that's not really where it ends either. Native peoples have been discriminated against in this country still to this day. And life on reservations is really hard. Alcoholism rates and poverty rates are ridiculously high. Life expectancy is so low compared to white people, black people, people of different ethnicities and races. The native population suffers from a life expectancy that is just low and disgusting, and it's really, really sad. But some of the other things, some more concrete examples I can give you is the United States didn't approve native people's right to vote until 1924. They were the last group of people in the U.S. to be extended the right to vote. And most states figured out a way to stop them from voting well into the 50s and 60s, using different mechanisms and rules. It was very normal when those kids were removed to schools that they would end up in foster care, white foster care, and not be sent back to their families, or they were forced into adoptions. It was actually legal until the 1970s to take a native baby away from their parents and give it to a white family. Actually, the next slide is a letter from the 1950s, which I just find disgusting. But think about that. Imagine a native family in the 1960s had a child, and the day it's born, they can remove that child from the family and just give it to a white family. Again, an attempt to Americanize people. That's severe trauma, because if you think about that, I'm 46. I was born in 1974. If I had been born into a native tribe, I could theoretically have been taken away from my parents and placed with another family. And if you think about the impact of that on somebody's life or the way that they trust the American government, I think that's obviously something with a lasting impact. A lot of the native foster kids were sterilized so that they could not have babies, so they couldn't reproduce and have more native children. The United States government, and I don't mean to gloss over that, it's so disgusting to think that they took kids who were in the foster system because they were forced to be there because they were native, and against their will and against their family's will, they took away their ability to have children. Like, that's like forever, not like, hey, we're putting you on birth control pills. Like, they did like these horrible things to these people so that there couldn't be more native kids in some cases. It's just sad. It's really just gross and shameful. The United States government and state governments have broken treaty rights with tribes on several occasions. And I know you can be like, oh, there's casinos and they get to gamble and they can hunt out of season. Yeah, sure, but that's part of the treaties. And a lot of those casinos are owned by the same people that own the casinos in Vegas. So the tribe only gets a certain cut of that. And some of the tribes have actually been terminated as official tribal nations. They're not recognized by the government anymore for various reasons that range from shady to more shady, basically. Now, this next slide is actually a real letter from 1952. I think it's April 25th, 1952, from a white family to a native school, but this is the reply letter back. And it says, April 25th, 1952, Dear Mr. and Mrs. Seeley, thank you very kindly for your donation of $10 for my little Indians. Yipe. Yours is the first invitation that was ever extended to one of our papooses. That is like a big baddie word. I wouldn't say that out loud if I were like not reading this to you. Yeah, let's not use that word. To come and spend the vacation somewhere. We have a few little boys and girls who have no one at all interested, whether they live or die or come and go. I would send a little boy of 6 years old or older, or a little girl, whatever you prefer. These Indian children are very little trouble, especially the one I have in mind. If you really mean it, I will see to it we get him ready. You may have him anytime you desire. I'm not making any inquiries about you because it takes a good person to make an offer as you did. Please let me know with kindest regards. Guys, think about that. Really think about that. That means that this like school, boarding school, is selling a little kid to a white family with no background check, no nothing, no, hey, come and meet us, no interview. We don't know if this kid has a family, for $10. That's 1952, guys. That's, in history terms, that's not that long ago that a native child could be sold, ripped away from their family, sold to a white family. That makes me sad. Okay. I really don't know like how to even express like how wow that is. Okay. The last slide is about the economy of the West, and obviously there was a lot of different jobs people in the West could do, but it really kind of winds down to about three main things. But I want to talk really quick about women in the West. Because women came out as settlers too, they were often viewed as equal or pretty close to equal in the West, more so than the East, because the women had to work just as hard as farmers to start the land with their husbands or start the land for themselves. They had to work just as hard in any job as they did. When you got to the West, there was nothing. And so if your family had to build a home, everyone was pitching in. And so women were seen as a more valuable part of society. Yes, a lot of women were involved in the oldest profession. I just made air quotes, just so you know, which is prostitution. It was legal for starters in the West back then. And what really happened is a lot of women didn't necessarily stay in prostitution for that long. They made a lot of money, and then they used that money to buy businesses and saloons and hotels and start schools and do different things. And so a lot of the women were the most successful business people of that time period. It just kind of maybe had a start that I guess we don't always look on very fondly with today's rules. Because they were viewed more as equals, a lot of states in the West extended women the right to vote first. They didn't get to vote in all elections, but they got to vote in most of them. Now, for the men, there were three pretty common ways that men made money in the West. One of them was mining, obviously digging for gold, silver, quartz, lead, and whatever shiny stuff was selling that day. It was a really hard way to make a living. It's really hard work, and your chances of finding things are not as high as like maybe the movies and the history books make things out to be. Most people got nothing except rich and tired and old. The average miner was actually pretty young. And probably the person that made the most money off of the mining was a guy named Levi Strauss, who many of you guys might know for Levi's jeans. He partnered with somebody else to make the more modern version of jeans that you guys know, and the rivets and the pockets and all that stuff. So he's really probably the person that benefits the most from mining. One of the interesting things about mining that happens is every time gold gets found, thousands of people show up. And so these things called boom towns happen. Boom towns are places where there's nobody, and then the population explodes overnight. A lot of lawlessness, a lot of young people with a little bit of money and not a lot to do when they're not working. And so they become like big time crime areas. But a lot of boom towns, because they were so new, didn't have justice systems. They didn't have sheriffs and deputies and, a jail. And so they turned to vigilante law systems. Now, a vigilante is someone who takes the law into their own hands and acts as like the judge, jury, and executioner. Probably the most famous pop culture vigilante would be Batman. I'm just saying, you've never seen me and Batman in the same place. So just think about that for a second. Let it sink in. Anywho, but vigilantes would, when they thought someone committed a crime, they would basically punish them there and there. And they had really unique ways for getting rid of people. One of the ones I think is the most interesting is something called drawing and quartering, where they tie a rope to each one of your wrists and a rope to each one of your ankles, and then hook you to horses, and the horses run off in 4 separate directions. And they pull your arms and legs off, and then you bleed to death and you die. Eventually, mining camp life settles down. The people get older, people get married, they have kids, there's schools, less mining, more established like corporations that do that stuff. And so people settle into jobs I think they were more used to in the East. 2 other ways that people really got a lot of money were cattle ranching. I'm not going to go too deep into cattle ranching because I think you guys all know that Americans like their hamburgers and their steaks, and there needed to be some organization and a way that meat got to the East. And so cattle ranchers set up a system of moving the cattle to railroad lines and doing auctions, and then moving the cattle to Chicago where they were slaughtered, and then selling them. Probably the big confusion about the West is the role of cowboys, and cowboys' jobs really were on these cattle ranches to help move the cattle and get them from point A to point B so that people could, enjoy their delicious sirloin. Farming, though, was probably by far the biggest business of the Old West. And farming's hard work, man, especially back in the old days when there were no tractors and combines and, all that kind of stuff. It was all by hand. And land was kind of the American dream. And so when the government comes up with the Homestead Act, which was a way that farmers could get acreage of land for a really, really cheap amount of money, people moved west for that free land. Farming was still really hard because most of it was by hand. If you had 40 acres and you had to use a garden rake and a garden hoe, you weren't going to get a lot done. And so new inventions really make things better. 2 of the big inventions that really changed farming in the West are barbed wire. I know, barbed wire. Who thought stupid stuff, whatever. But it helps keep animals out of your fields. And then this blacksmith from Vermont comes to Detour, Illinois, and he makes these steel plows that he paints green and yellow, and they help plow the field faster. And that's John Deere, and that kind of helps change farming as we know it. Another problem in the Great Plains is the lack of water. How are you going to get water to your crops? And so they figure out that there's an aquifer, underground water source under most of the Great Plains. And so people start to drill down and pump the water out using windmills and watering their crops. And all in all, the Midwest goes from being the great American desert to the breadbasket of America. Now, I covered a lot fast today. Remember, the slides are on Classroom. I apologize. I know it was a lot. I'm sorry. My voice even hurts from talking so much today. I'm out of practice. All right, if you have questions, let me know. Quiz tomorrow. Get your homework done.